Sometimes users are on a page and they start editing things, and then they realize they want to go somewhere else. But they're not quite finished with their changes, so when they leave the page, what happens? Well, wouldn't it be nice if we could store up those changes and save those off to a work in progress? Well, we have everything we need to do that right now. So in this module, we're going to learn how we can save a user's progress using a combination of Angular, Breeze, and local storage, using the features and the patterns that we've already used throughout this course. And this will allow the user to be able to go off the page and come back, close the browser, save up a bunch of changes for new records, edited records, and then view them in a list so they can come back to those changes and either cancel them or finish them up at a more convenient time. When we build applications, we want to make sure that the user experience is high. And I don't mean pretty screens and things flying around. What I really mean is making sure that the user has a good experience. And the way to do that is to make sure that we don't leave them feeling like, geez, what did I just do? How did that go wrong? So when I'm in the middle of editing a record, let's say I'm here on a Keynote, and I want to change this title from Keynote to, we'll just put in 1, 2, 3 for now. And now, let's say they get called by somebody else and they have to go look at something different. Well, they didn't press save, so let's say they go off the page to speakers now. What happened to those changes? Did they get lost? Did they get saved? Did something make an error? Well, the user has no idea at this point to know what happened. Well, let's go back to the sessions and find out what happened. So now we see the Keynote did not change here. Well, that could mean that maybe the session did change on the edit screen, but not here. So we're really not sure what happened yet still, but now we come here, we verify that the changes did not take place. But there was no visual indicator to let the user know that something happened at all. So we want the user to have a good experience in this. We want it to be very clear of what's happening. And there's a couple ways we could solve this. We could allow the user to make some changes here, and then when they click the back button, maybe we prompt them and say, hey, wait a minute, we know there's been changes here. Before you leave, you need to save them or cancel them. And that's a perfectly valid paradigm. But in this module, we're going to take a different approach. Something I've tried with some of my applications, where it allows the users to queue up those changes. So now, when they hit the back button, what will happen is it'll actually queue up all these work in progress records. We're going to save off the changed records and the original state. And then we'll give the user a screen to notify them of how many of these work in progresses they have and some kind of visual indicator in the menu over here on the left. And that way they can add new records, edit new records, make a bunch of changes to speaker sessions or whatever else is in the app, and then come back to them at a later time. So now let's take a look at what we would like to happen in this case. So we go into the Sessions page and we click into a session like Keynote. Let's make a change now. We'll watch the alerts in the bottom right hand corner. We'll change the Keynote to have Keynote space just 1. And right there, after about a second, you can see an updated WIP. There was a delay on there. And the reason there's a delay is we don't want to actually save off our work in progress every time somebody types a keystroke. Instead, we're going to wait until we think they're done with whatever set they're changing. So we kind of just keep an eye on the keystrokes and we call a debounce function, which will make sure that we just save every 1 second after they're done typing. So now I can type in something like this and notice it's not saving until I stop. And then we wait a second and now it's saving. Now I can leave the screen, and before I do, you'll notice that we've got work in progress over here. It's been alerting the user. I can go back to sessions. I still have that. Now let's click into speakers real quick. And this time, instead of editing, let's add a new speaker. And we do that here. Let's name the speaker Foo. And then as soon as we're done, after about a second, we've got some work in progress. And now, lo and behold, we have work in progress 2 over here on the left. Now if we flip back over to the work in progress screen, which will be a new screen that we create, we can see we've updated our WIP here, and we can see that we've got the 2 records right in place. Notice it's telling us one's modified and one's added. So if I click back into the added record, there we go, and now it's giving us the validation because that was a new record. So we can type in foo and bar. And if we'd like to, we can cancel it. When we cancel here, it'll remove it from WIP, and it'll also remove it from this menu on the left. By the end of this module, this is the behavior that we'll have built into the application. So now that we know what we want to accomplish, how do we actually allow these unfinished changes? Because the key for all this is making sure we can store everything in work in progress. So we're handling that question of what happens when the user makes changes but doesn't click save or cancel. Maybe they close the browser, maybe they go to another menu item. And technically, we're going to use HTML5 local storage to save off these work in progress changes, or WIP. So technically what we're going to cover are the use cases for listening to changes to the events on the entity, so we know when to actually save our work in progress. And then we'll automatically save that, We'll basically put a debounce in there of about 1 second so we can save it after a bunch of keystrokes. Of course, we'll not only have to handle saving it, but also canceling and getting the work in progress, and then loading it into the controller so we can see it on the view. We'll deal with serializing a single entity to local storage and giving it a key value so we can find it later. And there's a slight variation on how we have to do this for both new entities or edited entities. For example, an edited entity is a little bit easier because we already have an ID for that entity. But for new entities, we don't have an ID, so we have to have a way of saving it and then knowing which one to go get later on. So there's some logic around that we're going to have to craft. Then of course, the whole thing's about the user experience, so we have to add some visual cues to let the users know when there is work in progress, and some views that they can manage going back into those. And the actual features we're going to use are going to start out with HTML5 local storage. And then we're going to create our own directive using Angular to show those visual indicators for the work in progress. And then a new view and a controller for the work in progress screen. Of course, all the APIs from Breeze for loading and clearing out and saving WIP. And because we like good separation patterns, we're going to keep it wrapped up inside of an Angular service. And we'll be using a storage service that comes with the package we installed in the previous module. So now that we know what we want to accomplish, why we want to accomplish it, and the technical features that we're going to use to implement it, let's go code it. So our story of work in progress starts because a user wants to store changes as they go. So let's make the data services aware of work in progress. We've got this service we can take advantage of. So let's go inside the data context and the repositories where we're going to need to save work in progress and inject the service for storage. So we'll open up the services folder and go into the data context. And the name of this service is going to be ZStorageWIP. And this service comes with the same package that we installed previously in the previous module, and it's inside the scripts folder in the file called Angular Breeze Storage WIP. We can see inside of here, there's our service down below called ZStorageWIP. And it's got some APIs in it for clearing all the WIP, finding a key for the entity, initializing it, getting a summary of the WIP, loading it, removing it, and saving it. So we'll take advantage of that inside the data context. Next, let's expose it from the data context. We don't need to expose it, but it's just a convenience method. And then inside of the init, we'll also have to initialize the ZStorage here. Just like we did for ZStorage, we'll do it for ZStorageWIP, and we'll pass in the manager. And the reason it needs that is because it's got awareness of how Breeze works and that the entity manager has these import entities and export entities features. Now we have some screens like session details and speaker details where we do a lot of changes. So in those particular repositories, the ones that they use, we're going to have to add awareness of what this storage WIP is. So let's go inside of the repository for session, and let's also open the one up for speaker. And we'll inject the service into both of these. Then after we inject it, we'll make sure it's exposed. And now let's flip over to the repository for sessions, and we'll do the same thing. So now our data and repository services are all going to be aware of the ZStorageWIP service, so we can save off and load from work in progress. Before we can actually save off to work in progress, we need to know when it's appropriate to save to work in progress. Fortunately, Breeze exposes a way for us to know when we have to save the WIP. So first, let's go into the data context and we'll listen for this event. So we'll start by subscribing to the manager's entity changed, and whenever he's changed, we're going to get these change arguments, and we'll check those and see if a property has changed. Now specifically, this means that some property on this entity changed, and whenever a property changes on it, we're going to want to save off to WIP. That way, whether we're changing first name or last name or title or whatever it happens to be on that object, it's going to alert us through this event. So at that point, we want to broadcast our own event. So we're going to use one of the features in the common module called common.broadcast, which is a wrapper for the broadcast service that Angular exposes. And we're going to call an event called entities changed. Now this is going to be our own custom event. It doesn't exist yet, so we'll have to go define that. And the place we've been defining all of our events is inside of config. So let's open up the Solution Explorer, and we'll go find config. Now you can see down here, here's all the events that we've been defining. I'm going to add one here called entities changed. And we'll give that an event a name of data context entities changed. And that name is important because that's the name we're going to broadcast with right here, and then somebody's going to have to listen for that. So before we do that, we need to make sure that we set this event up. So we have to call this method in the beginning of the data context. An ideal place for that's inside the init. And now we're all set to go. So we're going to be listening for any changes on entities. So Breeze is going to let us know, and then our data service is going to intercept that. And then we're going to use an Angular message, basically an event, to fire off to let everybody know, hey, if you're waiting to know if there's any changes to our entities, well, it happened now. And that'll be their cue to save off to work in progress. We need to save all the WIP in the appropriate places. And the first place we're going to start is inside of the controller for session detail. And to start, let's create a method down here that's going to help us save the WIP. Let's create a function, and we'll call it store WIP entity. So we're going to store the session entity whenever there's a change. So first we should make sure we actually have an entity. That's our little safeguard, and if not, we're going to get out of here. And then we're going to call the store WIP entity function on the zStorage WIP service. So let's start refactoring that to make it work. On the data context, remember we exposed the zStorage WIP. And it's got this method on here called store WIP entity, and it accepts a couple parameters. The first of which is going to be, what do you want to save? Well, it's going to be our VM session. Then it wants to know what is the key for that thing. We'll create a local variable here called WIP entity key. Then we want to know what is the name of the entity. So we'll have an entity name variable, and then a description for it. So what we're filling in here is the item we're going to save, a key, and then to describe it, we're giving it the name of the entity. It's going to be like session, and then the description, something about that particular session. And this will show up in a view that we're going to create so we can see all these items. So we'll have to create those variables, and then this is going to return back the WIP entity key. So we're going to pass in the key and then get it back as well. That's important because maybe the key might change. So first, let's go ahead and create the description right here. And this will be custom for any kind of entity we have. Because it's a session, it makes sense that we'll give it a description of the title. And if there is no title, maybe it's a new entity, we'll go ahead and put in here new session. And then for grins, we'll just put on the session ID at the end of it. So we've got our description, but we still don't have some of the other parameters here. Let's move this down so we can see them all. Do we have a session? We certainly do. We have a description, so we got the sandwich ends here. Do we have the entity name? Well, let's go up here and look. We don't have a shortcut variable for this, so let's create one. So we want an entity name up here, and that's going to come out of the model. The model's got this entity names list, remember? And one of those is a type session. Now, did we inject model yet? No, so let's go ahead and do that now. So that covers us on the third parameter. Now the second one was this WIP entity key. We have to define this somewhere. So let's go back up top. In our list, we'll define that. And to start off, it is going to be undefined because we haven't done anything with it. Now that we have a way to save the WIP, let's go ahead and create a method that'll save it for us. So we want to automatically store the WIP whenever any changes happen, either from the event that we just listened to or because the user starts typing or we have some other conditions. So let's create a function here that'll handle this for us and basically be a wrapper to call store WIP entity. Now we could just say go ahead and store the WIP entity, but really what would be the point because we're just making a pass-through method. What we really want to do here is say, okay, if the user starts typing, don't actually store the WIP entity until they're done typing for 1 second. So we're going to use a function inside of our common module, and that function is going to be called a debounced throttle. And what this is going to do is it's going to delay the actual saving of the entity to storage for 1 second. We're going to pass in the controller ID because it tells us where do we come from, and then what do you want to call? Well, that's going to be our store WIP entity method. And then what's our delay in milliseconds? Well, it's going to be 1,000 milliseconds. And then we can also pass in a parameter for, well, if you want to skip the delay this one time, we'll pass a parameter to designate that. So we'll allow that to be passed through here. That could be a Boolean of true or false. So now we have a way of saying, all right, go ahead and save this, but don't actually save it for 1 second. So that way, if it gets like 10 calls to this thing, it's going to keep waiting until it's actually waited for 1 second before it'll actually save. Now we need to know when to actually call this thing. Well, the first place we're going to do that is whenever we listen to that event that we created over in the data context. So let's listen for that event, and we'll do this alphabetically here. So after we have this on destroy, let's set up an event for listening to the every change that we have. So whenever there's a change to the entity, we're going to set up this scope to listen, and we're going to use that event that we created called events entity changed. And when that happens, we're going to call a function, and that function is just going to call AutoStoreWhip. We're not going to pass any parameter in because we want it to actually use the delay. So that's the first place we're going to call AutoStoreWhip. Well, another great place to call that is going to be on destroy. So if somebody cancels, we want to make sure that we save as well. In that case, we want no delay. We actually want to make immediate equal to true, right? So let's pass in true. Now somebody's got to call this on every change to set up that event to be listened for. And the ideal place to do that is going to be up top, right inside of our activate. So after we activate the controller, we'll set up a then for the promise. We'll tell it to call on every change. So before we run it, let's make sure we understand what's happening. Down here, after we activate the controller, on every change, let's go look at that method, we're going to listen for this entity's changed event. And that's when we're going to automatically store our whip. And storing the whip means that we're going to go ahead and bounce the throttle, wait a second, and then call store whip entity right there, which will save off through the ZStorage service the entity that we had. So back inside it on every change, the key is understanding when we're actually going to have this happen. That's going to be on the entity's changed event. So let's go look at the data context where this gets fired from. So down here, we're saying that any time that the entity manager sees this entity changed, and the entity action happens to be Breeze entity action, and ooh, that should be property change. That's the actual name of the entity action. Whenever that happens, then we're going to broadcast out our message for entities changed, and that's going to be received back by the controller. Now, before we want to test this, let's turn off the local storage savings of all the entities first. So let's go back to config.js. And down towards the bottom, we hit enabled in our storage config provider, saving off all the entities local storage. We'll turn that off for now just so we can test whip without worrying about what else is in local storage. So now let's run the application. And we'll open the debugger tools and refresh so we clear out from cache. And then let's go ahead and go right into local storage just to make sure there's nothing in there, because there might be something residual. So right there we can see there's no pairs. If you have any pairs, go ahead and delete it out. And then let's go into the sessions. We can do that by clicking on this tile right there. And then after we do that, let's go ahead and click on a session, choose your favorite. We'll make sure the resources tab is still open. There's nothing in local storage right now. Now when we start typing in here, 1, 2, 3, we wait about a second and boom. There we ended up with 2 keys and a message at the bottom saying we updated whip. Now these 2 keys are helping us with our whip. The second key here is a summary for all the whip. So we can see it's cc_angular_breeze.whip. And then inside of there, we can open up and take a look real quick. We see there's an ID and a date and a key. It's got a bunch of information about the whip. And if you open up a text editor and paste it in there, we can see the information. Now here's a summary of all the different kinds of work in progress that we've had. So this is going to be an array of the summaries of the work in progress. So if we have more of these, we'll actually have more objects in there. So now let's go ahead and take a look at the other key. Now I'll take this, replace that. Now here you can see, here's the full-blown entity that was saved off to storage. We've got information about the session, the keynote, and the title, and then you can see the original values down here. The title was Keynote, and now it's actually Keynote 1, 2, 3. And this is how we save our work in progress. Now we can save our whip, but we also need to make sure we can remove it when we delete or cancel. So let's start inside the cancel function, and after we call the data context cancel, we'll put in a stub for a function called remove whip entity. So we'll have to write that code to basically remove the entity from work in progress when we cancel. We'll want to do the same thing when we do a delete. So if a delete is successful, before we go to sessions, let's go ahead and call that remove whip entity. Now let's go create this function. Now our ZStorage whip service has got a function on it called remove whip entity, so we'll just call that. And it's going to need the parameter of whatever that whip entity key happens to be for this particular session. So remember that key that we got after we stored the whip entity? Down here on line 137 we get that key, and it's local to this controller, and we can remove it by using this key. So now let's test this out. Load up our application. We'll make sure we have the developer tools open and then refresh so we can clear out the cache and get the latest JavaScript. Then up here, let's go ahead and delete out our storage. Now let's click on a session. We'll go back into one of the sessions here. And let's make a change to 1, 2, 3 for the keynote, and we should see the storage up there. And now if we click cancel, it should be deleting the key. And notice the key is gone, For the individual storage, that was by the GUID, and then our overall summary is still there, but it's got an empty array. So we can see that our removal works. Our application tries to be smart about how often it goes and gets data and how it caches information. But we have a slight problem. Let's demonstrate this with a story. So let's say we're inside of here and we click on the sessions. Now we've got the network tab open and we can see all of our traffic, but let's clear it out for now. Now let's go to the Keynote session and watch the traffic. So we selected that session. We have two elements that came through. The HTML page, which will now be cached, and then also a query to go get the session information for Scott Guthrie's Keynote. And the reason we got this session is because before we only had the partial session to show in the list of all the sessions. Now we've got a full-blown session with all the details. Well, let's watch how we cache things. So let's clear out the network traffic. We'll go back, and then we click on the session for Keynote. This time there should be no traffic over here because we already have the full-blown session for Scott Guthrie. We also didn't see the HTML as well because Angular cached the template, the browser cached the images, and then also Breeze is caching the full session, and our code remembers the fact that we had that. And that's all because we had session is partial equal to false when we fetched it. So again, if we go back and we come back into this session, zero traffic at all. Now let me show you the problem. So let's change the title from Keynote to Keynote Hello. Notice here we've updated the WIP and we've made changes. Now let's cancel the change. Still no network traffic, right? Because we're all doing this locally. Now let's go back to the session. Still no traffic. And when we click on the Keynote, we shouldn't see any traffic, right? But we do. So why is that happening? Breeze is going back to the server to get this full Keynote session. But why? We already had it before. We demonstrated that multiple times. The reason it's doing it is because it sees that the session is partial flag is set to true when we entered the screen. But wait a minute, I just said before that we set that equal to false after we already went into the screen before. And we did. Until we hit the cancel button. Once we hit cancel, we rolled back all the changes, including the isPartial property, and it was restored to its original true state, which means that we had a partial entity. So therefore, Breeze says, okay, you canceled, you have a partial entity now. Next time you come into here, I'm going to go get the full entity. So that's not really the behavior we want. We want to make sure that when Breeze rolls back the entity to its original values, when we call reject changes, we expect Breeze to restore the original session title and other properties on it, but not the isPartial. We just want the isPartial property, which is one we extended on the client model, to stay the way it was. So we've already set it to false. Let it stay false for life now. And the reason we want that is because we don't want to continually hit the server for information that we already had. So what the solution is to make Breeze forget that we ever changed that property. So let's go see how to do that. The place we're going to add this code is in the bottom of the data context. We'll add a new function down here, right below the event for setup event for entities changed. Let's call this the intercept property change. And what we're going to do here is we're going to make Breeze forget all about the isPartial and the isSpeaker properties. Those are those properties we added in the model. We'll go take a quick look there just to refresh our memories. So if we look inside the model.js, we come down here, we can see that we added properties to the person for isPartial and isSpeaker. And we also did that for the session right here. So let's go back into the data context and let's remove those from the original values. And the way we're going to do that here is we're going to grab the change property. And if that change property happens to be the isPartial, or the change property happens to be the isSpeaker, let's use the delete command in JavaScript to remove the property from the object. So we're simply saying go on to the entity aspect, that's the property that Breeze adds onto the entity, and go into its original values for that property and remove it. Now we need to know when to call this guy. Well, luckily, we already have a hook into the event that we need. So whenever a property changes on the entity, we want to make sure that we intercept that and we remove it. And just for our future reading pleasure, let's add a few comments in here. This explains in more detail what we're actually doing. And again, ultimately, we're not wanting to track the changes to these properties, so we're going to remove them. Now let's run the code again and demonstrate it. We'll open the developer tools, we'll refresh so we clear out the cache. And now let's clear out the traffic. We'll go over into sessions. We'll clear out the traffic again here. We click on the Keynote. We see our 3 rows. We got the image of the person. We got the data for the session, the full data, and then the HTML. We'll clear that out. We go back. Now let's go forward back into the Keynote. We shouldn't see any traffic, and we don't. Now let's change the Keynote title again to Keynote Hello. And this time, we don't see any changes there, of course. We cancel. We go back. And before, when we clicked on the session this time, because we made changes, we would have gone back to the server and gotten data. And notice, this time, we do not. So now, we're truly saving that extra trip. Right now, we're saving the WIP, but we have no way of getting the WIP back out and loading it into our controller so the user can see it. So what we need to do is find the place in our code, which is right here in Get Requested Session, where we go get that session. And instead of just getting it by the ID, we need this function to be able to check to see if we have it in WIP, get it from there. Otherwise, get it remotely. So really, instead of this, we'll write something more like data context session instead of get by ID. We'll call this get entity by ID or from WIP. Now, of course, this doesn't exist yet, so we'll have to go write it. And we'll put a to-do here to come back and edit this. So where do we write this code? Well, there's a couple places we can do it. We could put this in the repository session, because that's what we're getting is a session. But we're going to want to do this for any kind of WIP. Meaning, based upon whatever that key happens to be, it could be a session or a speaker or any other kind of thing that we happen to use it for. So what's a great place to do that? Well, it'll be the repository abstract. That way all the repositories can get that method. So let's go inside of there and add that function. First, we'll expose the function right up here. And now let's write the function. We'll pass in a value, and it's going to have to determine, is that going to be a WIP entity key or is it going to be an ID? So first things first, let's check to see what it actually is. We've got a common function here called isNumber inside the common module. And if it is a number, like it's session 13, we want to find out if we have any work in progress for it. So let's parse out the value. And then let's go call one of our storage WIP functions to find the WIP key by the entity ID. And we'll tell it the entity name, whether it's a session or a speaker, and then the value. So we'd be calling into this with like session and then val might be 13. And if it finds one of those, it's going to tell us that, all right, we've got it in work in progress. Now I'm going to return back to you the key for that guy. So that's going to become our entity key. So let's check to see if we got anything back. And if we didn't get anything back, now we know we have nothing in work in progress for it. Go ahead and just get it remotely, get by ID. We've got that function right here. So we can say, go ahead and call this entity name, and we'll pass in the ID of 13. Now, if we did not exit the function by that point, now we know we have to go look in work in progress for it. So let's get a local variable here called imported entity, and let's load the entity into that. Our storage WIP service has a function on it called load WIP entity, and we pass to that the entity key. And then if something comes out, which it should because we just found out that we have one, then we want to use it. So first, we'll grab that entity and we'll validate it. And the reason we're validating this is to make sure that we revalidate after we rehydrate the entity. Because it just came out of local storage, we want to make sure that when we pull this back into Breeze's cache that we validate this with any validation rules we have. And then after we do that, let's go ahead and return a promise. And that promise is going to contain the entity and the key. Now if at this point we didn't return already, then we've got a problem. So we'll return back a promise still, but instead of returning back an actual entity, we'll return back an error message. So now we've encapsulated all the logic for finding a generic entity of type session or speaker or whatever. So we're going to pass in an ID, maybe 13 for a session, and it's first going to check to see, all right, we'll go look and see if we have it in work in progress. If we don't, go get it remotely. If we did have it, then it's going to go check to see, all right, let's go get that guy out of work in progress, and then we'll return him. So now back in session detail, we can call that function, and we don't need this line of code anymore. And in our then, the first thing we're going to do is get the WIP entity key, because we want to reset that. And then the session might come back as being data.entity, because it might have come out of WIP. And if that doesn't exist, we're going to get back from data. So if it comes back as WIP, it's going to come back as data.entity. And if it comes back from remote, it's just coming back like this. And we can put a little bit of error logic in here too to say, you know what, if we were unable to get that session, let's also go to sessions when we're done. So we'll show the error message and then go back to the sessions page because we don't want to sit on an errored out session details page. So now let's test this out. So we run my app, we open up the developer tools, let's refresh. And now let's go into sessions. We'll click on the keynote. We'll type in 123 at the end of that keynote. We'll go back. And now when we click on the keynote, we should see there's our 123 because it's actually pulling the entity out of work in progress or our local storage and showing it. Now when I say it's pulling it out, it's not removing it from work in progress, it's keeping it there. It's actually still in local storage. We can see that over here by clicking on the resources and opening up local storage. So let's take a look at the first guy up here. We'll open up Sublime again, we'll paste that in. And there we can see the title is Keynote 123, and down below we can see the original value was just Keynote. So what we've done here is now enabled both saving and retrieving the WIP item from local storage. The next chapter in our story involves making this work not only for sessions but for speakers. So, we've done this once, but can we do it again? Well, let's find out what it would take. So let's go inside of the speaker details. And what we want to do is add in the canceling and the loading and then the saving features for WIP. So let's close anything we don't need to look at, and then we'll go back into session detail. Up top, notice that we added this model in here for the session detail. Well, let's add that over into the speaker detail. So why do we need that? That's because we added this entity name to the top of the session detail. So we'll do the same thing over here, but it's not going to be for session. This one's going to be for speaker. We also added one other local variable. That's the WIP entity key. So let's go ahead and do that. Now let's scroll down into the activate, because after we activate, we want to call the on every change. Well, we haven't written that yet, but we'll go ahead and grab it. So it means we need that on every change. Let's go get that guy. Now he's looking like he needs auto store WIP, so we'll grab him. We'll methodically go through and make sure we grab everything we need. And one of the things to be careful about when you're copying and pasting is make sure that one thing was a session, the other is a speaker, that there's nothing in here that says the wrong word. So in auto store WIP, we're good. Let's go down and look at on every changed. We're also good down here. So back in session detail, we've got this code up here for activating it. We call on every change. We've got the auto store WIP. Inside of cancel, you may remember that we also removed the WIP entity. So let's do that inside the speaker details cancel. Then moving on down the line, nothing changed in can save. And the delete, we also did the remove entity, but we didn't have a delete in the speaker, so there's nothing to do there. Now let's scroll down to the get requested session. The big thing that changed here was the way we called into the get entity by ID or from WIP. So let's see if we can reuse that code. So inside of here, we're going to need to go get the function that actually gets the speaker. So let's find that. That's called get requested speaker. And instead of getting it by ID, like this, instead, we'll call into data context speaker, get entity by ID or from WIP. And then the data we get back was a little different. So in this, we're going to get back the entity key. And then the speaker could either be from data entity or from data, depending upon whether it came from WIP or not. And then when we logged our error, we called go to session. So if there's an error with the speaker, we can call into go to speakers. Okay, so we're good on there. Let's keep on scrolling down, and we'll take a look down here inside of the on destroy. We also called auto store WIP, so we'll do that for speaker detail. We already added the on every change. We need to make sure we have the remove WIP entity function, so let's make sure we pull that from here over to speaker detail. Inside the save, we didn't do anything, and of course we've got the store WIP entity. So we'll make sure we grab that, and that does have specific stuff in it for session, so we'll have to make some changes as we add that down here. So let's walk through this one. Here's where we're saying go ahead and grab the view model for the session. That's going to be the speaker. And the description in this case isn't going to be the title. Instead, we'll make it use the full name of the person. If there is none, because it's new, we'll say new speaker. And we'll make it show the speaker ID. And then we have to pass in the speaker, not the session. We'll still pass in the key, the entity name, and the description, which we defined right there. But because this is a speaker, there's one extra little thing we have to do. And for this, we're actually going to pass in a route state. And this is used by the whip to know, okay, somebody clicks on a URL that you create later to go directly to your work in progress for this record. I need to know what route to go to for it. I didn't need to do this for the sessions because for session, it's going to go to session / because it knows the entity type. For this one, the entity type is actually a person, and we don't have a route called person. So I'm going to tell it explicitly, use this route state right here, and we'll pass that in. That way, even though this is really of type of person, because that's what a speaker is, it's going to route to this overridden route state of speaker. So with those changes, we should also be able to see our whip for the speakers. Let's check it out. And again, we'll open up the developer tools and we will refresh from cache. We'll take a look at local storage and make sure you clear it out if you haven't. And let's go inside the speakers. We'll also make sure we have no errors, so I'll hit the escape key. No errors down here. Perfect. We'll get rid of that again. Now let's go inside of Aaron Sconard. Sorry, Aaron. We'll click on his name and we'll type in Aaron123. We should see local storage appear, and we do. So now let's back out. We didn't change anything. Notice it still says Aaron here. We'll click back into Aaron. It should be reading the whip, which it is. And now if we cancel, it should remove that whip, which it also did. So now we have work in progress for both sessions and speakers. Our story's not over. Now that we're saving and loading in work in progress, we need to have a way to actually see that we have some work in progress saved off somewhere. So we want some visual indicators for this. Specifically, in our menu, we're going to add a new item here called work in progress, and it's going to do a couple things for us. One, it's going to show an asterisk if there is any in orange. Two, it's going to show the number of records that are being in work in progress. And then three, when you click on this, it's going to go to a new view, which will be called WIP, which will show us a list of all the work in progress records that we have. So let's go do that. Let's start this story from the view. So let's go inside of the layout for the sidebar HTML. We'll take a look at how we actually added menu items. Well, first we're repeating through all the menu items, and then we're adding in the clear storage one that we added. But now we want to add a different kind of a menu item. So we'll add in a new list, and we're going to create a directive here. And we haven't created this yet, but we're going to do it together. It's going to be called CC Whip. And it'll have some parameters, but it's also going to have the class in here to make it work with that blue color when it's highlighted. So first we're going to want to pass in some data for this. It's going to want to know about that whip summary. So we'll get that from our vm.whip property, which we'll create. Because it's actually going to route to a view, we're going to want to pass in the routes as well so we can know when it's actually been selected. And somebody's going to have to notify this guy when there's actually been a change to whip. So we need to know what the name of that event is. So now we know we need to create this directive called CC Whip, and it's going to have three different things that we're going to be able to pass to it. Now those things are going to come from sidebar.js, so let's go create them now. Because that's the controller bound to the sidebar HTML. So the first thing that we had back in the HTML was whip. Let's go ahead and add that in sidebar. And by default, there's going to be none. And then when we activate, let's go get the whip summary. So we're going to set that property here using the data context, calling into the ZStorage web service, and then it's got a function there called getWhipSummary. Now the whip summary is going to get that one single record in local storage that tracks all the different work in progress that we have. So that'll take care of the whip parameter. Now let's get the routes. Now all we have to do for that is say routes right there. That's because we're already pulling in the routes. It was actually a value that we had in our app. So the final parameter that we want to pass in here is the changed event. Let's come back into here, and that was called whip changed event. And that's going to come from config. And it's got this events, it's a storage event, and it's called whip changed. Let's make sure we got the right name here. Let's go over to config. We'll scroll down to our events, and there's storage, and there's whip changed. So now we've exposed all three of those from the controller, so our view can use those for the directive. The next step is to write the directive that's going to give us the functionality that we desire. So let's go write the CC Whip directive. We're keeping our directives right now in a single file, although we could split these out as they start to grow. But for now, we'll just go into the directives file. Let's scroll on down to the bottom, and we're going to copy the directive here for the CC widget header just to give us an outline. And we'll paste it there. And the first thing we'll do is change the name of that. It's just going to be CC whip. Now I'd like to put the usage inside of my directives so I know how to use them. So I'm going to go back to sidebar, and I've defined the usage like this. So let's go ahead and grab that, and we'll stuff it right inside here. Next, we'll make sure we've got the link, which we do here for the link function. We're going to change and delete out code there because we'll be writing different code. And we need some scope in here. Now we're passing in the whip, and that's going to use two-way data binding. So we'll put the equal sign there. We're going to need the changed event. That's actually just a string name, so we're good on that. And we also had the routes. And again, we'll use data binding to get those. And those three names there are what we had in the HTML. We can see those right here in the usage. We're going to make sure that we're allowing this only for an attribute, so we'll set it for A. And then the template is going to point to a function down here to get the template. So we'll just embed that HTML. So we'll call getTemplate. Let's go write that code. And here we're just going to return back a hyperlink that does the routing for us to go to the whip view. So you've got a hyperlink, which is going to pull in the route URL, and it's going to have the asterisk in it and the words work in progress, and then how many are in that length. And we'll use a function to get the class to either highlight it in blue or not. So a couple of these things we don't quite have yet. And the reason for that is we need to add a controller to this. Let's go ahead and add a controller function. And we're going to want to inject in the scope. So let's grab that here. Now, because we're defining a controller for it, we have to tell the particular directive about it. So that's going to go up top here. Now I'm going to put that alphabetically right above the link. We're going to say this guy here has got a controller, and it'll do minification safe injection. We'll say go ahead and grab the scope, and then call this function. That's going to define the controller. So going back down to the controller, let's fill in the features that we need. First, we know we need the whip route because it's right down here. We want to know where we're going to route to. So we've got this whip route, and by default, we'll set it to undefined. Now we need to be able to get the class to know if it's going to be the current one or not. And then we need to get the whip class to know if we got to show the asterisk or not. So to do that, the functionality will write here and say, all right, go ahead and return back if this whip exists or not. Which will be a function that we use, and if it returns back true, we'll return back icon asterisk alert. So that means we need this whip exists as well. And for this, we want to return true if there is any length to our whip, because that whip is going to be an array. And a little trick is, because length might be 2 or 3 or 4, and yes, that's the truthy value, the double bang will actually turn that into a Boolean. So when somebody passes in the whip, now we know if the whip exists or not, which handles whip exists, and the whip class. But we haven't yet defined the whip route, so let's do that now. So I like my controllers to have an activate function. It's just a pattern that I like to use. And of course, you've got to call the activate. So what should it do when it first kicks off? Well, first, let's grab a local variable for the event name. And that event name is the changed event, which we defined up here in the scope. And now let's listen for the whip changes. When those changes happen, we're going to set the whip, and then we're going to set the route. And the way we're going to set the route is loop through all the routes that we have in our array and find out if the title equals the route that we're looking for. So the routes have this property called config, which has got the title in it. And if that equals our work in progress route, then we're good. Well, I don't like magic strings, so we're going to get rid of that. And instead, we'll put in whip route name. We'll use a local variable for it. And then we'll make sure we get back the 0th element of that. So up top up here, we'll add in another local variable. This will be the whip route name. So now this is going to be the name of the route that we're going to have to define in our config.routes.js. So let's go do that now. We'll go to the bottom down here of our routes, and right after attendees, let's add a new one. And the URL is going to be the same as what we just typed. And for his config, let's set up the template. So we'll be creating a new view under a whip folder called whip.html. We'll give it a title, and we'll give it a default icon. Now slip back to our directives and finish up in here. We still have the link function for the directive. And that's an ideal spot to do a couple more things that we need this guy to do. Because right now he's just doing things when he activates. Now the link function is going to be able to give us a place so we can do a watch. We're going to put a watch on a function we're going to write called whip_is_current. So the watch is going to look at that function, and whenever it changes, it's going to do something. So what's that function going to do first? Well, whip_is_current is going to check to see if the whip is the current item. This way we know if we can toggle the blue highlight on the menu item. So we're going to check the route service to see what it is currently and what its title is. And if we don't have one, then we're just going to get out of there. Otherwise, we're going to check to see if the current title is the same as our route name. And if it is, we'll highlight it. So we're going to put a watch on this function, so it's going to check to see when those routes change if we need to highlight or basically unhighlight a particular menu item for the whip. So we'll evaluate that value, and if it's true, we'll add a class called current to the element. Otherwise, we'll just remove it. And now because we created a route that's actually going to point over to whip.html, let's go create that file. We'll put it inside of a folder called whip. And for now, let's just go ahead and copy the speakers HTML, put it inside of whip. We'll rename it whip.html. We'll go inside of that HTML. And let's delete everything out and just put in there whip. Now before we run this, let's review how it's actually going to work. So when this directive is used, it's going to go get a template, which is going to be this HTML down here, and then use that for the directive. It's going to put that right inside of our menu. Now, one thing we got to change is that it says template URL here. We're not actually pointing to a URL for a template. That's what we did up here. Instead, there's another property that we can set called just template. We're actually telling it this is exactly the template you want to use. Whenever you create a controller or a directive, you want to make sure anything you're injecting is actually in the dependency list. So let's make sure we've covered all of these down here. Now we don't need scope because that's actually being passed in there. And we do see we have an Angular service called route there. So I don't think we've injected that. Let's make sure we have. We come back up here. Nope, we did not. So just like we can inject into a controller, we can do that for the directive. So we want to use the route service and pass that into the function, and the parameter is going to become route. We'll scroll to the bottom of that function. Down here we can see ReSharper is telling us we've got a mistake. It's because we need that closing brace. Now we can minimize the get template. And here we need scope. Let's make sure we've got scope. It's defined in the whip controller. Well, let's make sure whip controller's got it injected. Up here it does. We can see that here on line 211. And then we have no other dependencies. So now we should be able to run this. Now let's open the F12 tools and we'll refresh. That'll clear out the cache for us. First things first, let's make sure there are no errors showing up over here, and there aren't unlisted. That's great. Now we don't actually have anything hooked up to that page, so we won't click on it yet, but let's go inside the sessions and we'll add some whip. So we'll click on the keynote. I'll change the keynote to keynote 123, and it should automatically notify over here. Notice we've got one record, and it's now starred. So we can click out of there. We can go over to speakers. We'll choose Brad Green, change his first name to Bradley, and see if the whip gets updated. And it did down here and up there. Now let's test a cancel. If we cancel our whip, it did decrement it as well. So now we've got the directive working for us. Now that we have a way of alerting the user to what's in the whip, we need to display it to them so they can actually select it and then go look at it. So we want to create some kind of a widget like this so we can display it both in the dashboard and then also in that whip.html view. And it's simply just going to be a list where they can select an item or they can cancel it all. So let's go add the code for our whip.html. We can open that up and we can see we've got nothing in there. We'll blank that out. Now let's go inside the speakers HTML and we're going to copy out some of the code in here for the sections. We'll just copy the whole file for now. Put it inside whip.html because it's got the basic structure that we need. So up top, we're going to have the section for main, then we're going to have the matter, we're going to have our container fluid, and then inside of here, that's where it's going to differ. We don't need a search form, so we're going to get rid of that. And then down below, let's go ahead and make this guy not be violet, but we'll make him orange. We'll still use the title, and then what we put inside the content will be slightly different, so let's get rid of that. And then starting back at the top up here, we're going to have a controller that's going to be called whip. And inside of the content where it's orange, this is where we're going to put the list of all the whip. So our header here is going to have VM title still, and then the subtitle is not going to be anything about speakers. It's just going to be the whip's length. And for the content, we're just going to use an ng include to pull in another file. Why another file? Because we're actually going to show this list of whip on this page and on the dashboard. So why type it twice? Now with an ng include, you want to make sure you're surrounding your single quotes with double quotes. So be careful about that. And we're going to point over to the app whip folder, and we're going to create a thing called a whip widget. And that's going to be what we actually include. And one final thing in this view is going to be a button to clear everything out. So up on the top, you may have thought we forgot about this, but we didn't. We're going to remove the rows entirely and just put the matter surrounding the container fluid. And then right above this widget, we're going to put a button. Button, who's got the button? I do. And the button's going to clear out all the whip. So a button has an ng click, and we're going to call a function called cancel all whip. And let's also be smart about it and disable this button if there is no whip. And we'll stick an icon in here, and we'll say cancel all work in progress. So now there's a couple of things we have to clean up on. One is the click function here, this cancel all whip. We have to put that inside the controller, which also means we need a whip.js controller. And then inside of there, we're going to have this function for cancel all whip. We're going to have the whip array, and of course the title. In addition to the controller, we're going to have to create this widget right there. So let's take the next step. Let's move along with the whip and actually create this whip widget HTML. So go back to the Solution Explorer, and let's create a new file here. And we'll delete all the HTML that it comes with. And let's start off with a div. And for this div, we're just going to create it here with some classes to give it a little bit of style. And based upon whether there is whip or not, we want to show different things. So if there is no whip, we're going to say a message here called no work in progress is found. But if there is whip, we want to show a table showing all the whip. So how do we do that condition? Well, this is where the ng switch directive comes in. So we'll use the ng switch directive right at the top, and we'll toggle this based upon the whip length. And just because I like to make sure I get the Boolean value there instead of just truthy or falsy, I'm saying the whip length. So if that's 1 or anything larger, that'll become true. And if it's 0, it just becomes false. So in addition to having the ng switch, now we have to have an ng switch when. So inside the first div here, we say when this is false, show that. And for the table, we'll do the opposite. We'll show this when it's true. Now that we have the structure for it, let's create the header and the row. And we'll create a heading here for item, description, state, and date changed. And this will be the entity name, its description, what's its state? Is it added? Is it new? Is it edited? And then also the date. And we'll create the body to match that. Now we can use our good old ng repeat directive here. And for this, we're going to go through the VM whip. We'll say item in VM whip. And if somebody clicks on one of these, we're going to go to that individual item. So if somebody clicks on the session that's been edited, it'll go right to the session details page. And let's match up all the TDs down here. And for the date, we're going to use a filter because we want to format this. Let's go one step further too. Let's make these sortable. So for the item at the top, we'll make this a hyperlink. We'll surround the word item with that. We'll set the href to nothing. Instead, we'll call an ng click. We'll create a function that just sets the sort. And we'll pass into that whatever the matching property name is. So let's do that down here for description and state and date changed. Now let's make sure we wrap up these guys. And then we'll change the names appropriately. And last but not least, let's give the table a little bit of style. And now that we're calling the set sort, we actually want to sort the guys down here. So in the ng repeat, we'll add a filter down here. And that's going to be an order by filter. And we'll point it into our controller to a member called predicate. And we'll also point it to a reverse member. So that functionality will be in the controller itself to determine what are you sorting by and is it in reverse order or not. So now we've got the views in place, let's go set up the controller. So let's go create the whip.js controller. We'll go over to the whip folder. We'll do add new item. We're going to use Sidewaffle again and choose the controller using controller as. This is going to be called whip.js. And we'll delete out some of these comments. And let's start with our activate. So when we activate, we're going to call the activate controller to get the whip summary. That's going to give us all the whip information. And of course, we want to actually call activate. And we don't need to expose it here, so we'll remove it from there. And our title is actually going to be work in progress. So let's go ahead and write the get whip summary, because that's going to get the whip for us. So we'll return this back into a property called vm.whip. We'll call the data context and its zStorageWhip. We're going to call that get whip summary function that we used earlier. So we don't have this data context, so let's go ahead and make sure we inject that. So that's going to get the whip summary the first time, but what if it happens to change? For this, we're going to listen to our whip changed event. And again, we're just going to set the whip equal to the changes. But we don't have config yet either, so let's go ahead and pull that in as a dependency. And while we're at it, we didn't have common, so we'll put that up there. So let's find out what else we needed. We've got our VM title and we've got our VM whip. If we go back to the whip HTML, we also have a cancel all whip. So let's write that. First, we know we need to expose that. Now we want to prompt the user to see if they actually want to do all of this. So we'll use some code that we've written before, which is basically using that Bootstrap dialog service. We'll tell it the title is work in progress, and then we'll call a local function for confirming the delete or canceling it. So we know we need to have this BS dialog, so let's put that in one of our dependencies. And now let's fill in the confirm delete and the cancel delete. Well, actually, cancel delete, we don't really have anything to do. So we'll just get rid of that, and we'll use the confirm delete. And if they confirm that they're deleting, we'll just call the data context method for clearing all the whip. And if you like, you can put this in line too. Let's go back into whip HTML. We've got the cancel all whip. We've got the whip itself. We've got our title. We've got our widget. So let's go look inside the widget now and see what we need. Here's our whip. We've got him. We don't have our set sort yet, so we can get that guy. We also don't have the go to whip. And we need our predicate and reverse. Let's start with the sorting. We'll start with the predicate, reverse, and the set sort. We'll initialize both these to blank and false. Now let's expose the set sort function. Let's go write it. Now he's going to accept in the property name. And the first thing he's going to do is take the predicate and set it to be that property. And then we got to set the reverse. And what's the reverse going to be? Well, it's actually going to be the opposite of what it was before, because we're just going to be toggling it on and off. So now we've handled the set sort, predicate, and reverse. We also had the go to whip right there. So let's go handle him now. So first we expose the function, and now let's go write it. And we know we're going to have to pass something into him, and that was the item that we passed in. And that's mirror whip data. And then when we get this, we're going to want to go to that page. So we're going to do some manual navigation here using the location service that Angular exposes. And we're going to tell, okay, go ahead and use that route state. Route state's that property that we set up for the sessions and speakers, so we know to go to /session or /speaker. And then the parameter we're going to pass in is going to be the whip data key. Now we don't have this location service. We got to make sure that we inject that as well. And just to initialize everything, we'll set up the whip up here to be initialized to an empty array. Let's make sure we didn't miss anything over in the HTML. So we've got our set sort function. We've got our filter set up to use the predicate and the reverse. And we've got our method here to go call the whip. So we can actually go over to that view. And then we'll be repeating all over this VM whip array for each one of those, listing out the entity description and state. Now, because we added a new controller, we have to add that to the index.html. So let's go do that. So down below, we can see all of our app files. We added in here whip.js. So now we should be able to run it and check this out. Let's open the developer tools and we'll go ahead and refresh the cache. And we'll click on work in progress. And it brings us to our page. So now we can see we have one whip item here. It's a session, that's the description, and there's a modified state and the date that we actually did that. Now let's clear that out. We can hit cancel, or we can actually clear it. Now it updated down here, removed it from there, and updated it from over in the left side sidebar. Let's add a new one with the speakers. We'll edit Colleen, change her name. We should see it over there. We should be able to click on that, and there we go. Let's add a new one. We'll go to speakers, add a new speaker, type in foo, and now if we go over to work in progress, we can see the state here is added. We can also sort these, clicking on description, flipping them back and forth, and when we click on the added one, notice that we got a GUID up here instead of the ID because we don't have an ID yet. So now we have a nice clean way to check out our work in progress. Now let's go add the WIP widget to the dashboard. So go into the dashboard HTML. So this is our widget that's got the tracks in it. Go ahead and minimize him for now. And then right after him, we're showing the news. So instead of that, let's move the news to its own row. And we'll make that row be 12 wide. And let's add a new span right down here. We're just copying the one we had above it for the tracks. And instead of being span 4, this one will be span 8. And this will contain our WIP. For him, we'll make it inside of an orange header. We'll make the header title just be VM title. And where's all this going to be coming from? Well, it's going to be coming from a controller. So we're actually going to define a controller for this particular widget. Why? Because we already have one. We just created this guy. So it's going to go off and get that WIP controller we created, which already had a title. We can set the subtitle to the length. Now for the widget content, we'll get rid of everything that's inside of there. And instead, we'll just stick in that ng include that we used before. And that should be all we have to do. And that's going to use this controller right over here. So if we run this, we should see it on the dashboard. We're not seeing it because we didn't refresh the cache. So let's refresh. And we'll make this go away a little bit. And if we scroll down, now we can see the work in progress right inside the dashboard, inside of one of our widgets. And it still has the sorting functionality that the other one had. And we can click on one of these and go right to that item. Well, our story is not quite finished yet. There's a couple loose ends we want to tie up. So first, let's make sure you've cleared out all your work in progress. And let's go through a scenario. Let's say we go into a speaker. Let's say Brad Green here, and we change his name. And then we go back to work in progress. We do some other work, we come back to the screen, and we click on this entry. Notice up at top in the URL, we see the GUID up there. That GUID is actually the WIP entity key. That's what's being used to pull that record out of local storage so we can see it here. We have two issues here. One is, if I change this now and I save, it should save the record of the database, get rid of the work in progress, and the URL should change back to whatever the ID happens to be for Brad. So let's try that. We got the save, so it saved off to the database. And then the work in progress, well, it didn't update. Why? Because I didn't remove the entity key. So we have to do that. And then also the GUID did not change. We didn't code this yet, but what we should do is if there's a GUID in the URL and you press save, we should revert back to the ID. So if that was ID number 12, we would put that up there. So let's go code this scenario. So first, let's do the easy part. When we save and it's successful, we want to make sure we remove the WIP entity key. So let's do that inside of session detail inside the saves success. And we'll also do that inside the speaker details success. So great, that was easy, nice low-hanging fruit. The second issue, where we want to replace the location URL, the GUID, with the ID, that'll take a little more work. But let's stub out the function first. After we remove the entity and we save, we want to make sure we replace that location URL with the ID. So let's create a function that does this. We'll pass in the ID we want to use, because we can use the same function for both the session and the speaker. And because we're going to reuse it, let's just create a service called helper, because everybody needs a helper service. Now we're in the speaker detail, so that's actually going to be a speaker. And we'll go back up to the cancel, and we'll add that in there as well. Now let's go over to the session detail and do the same thing. We have to remove the entity on the save. We'll save out and replace the location URL with the session ID. And we'll go up to the cancel. Now we need to inject the helper service. And we'll do that in the speaker detail. And then of course, we need to actually write the function. So the function is going to be called replace location URL GUID with ID. Nice and clear. So we'll go inside the services. We'll right click and do an add new item. We'll use Sidewaffle again, and this time we'll create an Angular factory. And it's going to be called helper. And it's going to have a method in there, just like we named it. And we're going to need the location in here because we're going to need to have access to it. So let's inject that right now. And first we'll get the path for the location. We got to do a little bit of slashing in here. Let's get the slash position. From the path, what's the last index of that slash? We'll get that. Basically, we're just going to parse out the piece of the URL that we need. We want the stuff that's before the GUID. So first we'll get that current parameter, and that's what's going to be that value. And if the current parameter happens to be a number, you know what? We're done. Just get out of there. We only want to handle it if it's a GUID. So if it doesn't get out at this point, now we want to go ahead and tack on the ID to the beginning part of that path. And then once we have that path, let's go ahead and set it. So now that we have our helper service, we need to add that into the index.html. And I like to keep them alphabetical because the order doesn't matter. So back in the helper.js, we need to make sure we've got all of our dependencies. Here we already pulled in location, but we're also using common down here, so we want to make sure we inject that as well. That's where that is number function. And we've got common injected. And now we also need to make sure we've got this ID parameter we're going to pass in, because that's what we're passing in from session detail right down here, the session ID, and we're also doing that for speaker. So now that we're all set, let's go ahead and run it and we'll test out our changes. We'll open up the developer tools and let's refresh the cache, get some fresh JavaScript. Let's go over to speakers. Let's pick somebody like Dave Ward. Let's add on to the end of his name a couple extra letters. Now we'll go to work in progress. And when we click on Dave, we should see the GUID up top. Now when we press save, we want to make sure the GUID goes away and we don't have any work in progress left. So let's see what happens. Boom, there we go. 32's up top and no more work in progress. This module was all about saving work in progress and then loading it back in so we could manage people's changes. And this enabled the scenario where users could have unfinished changes and then come back to them whenever it was convenient for them. And the keys to all this, remembering what WIP was, is to make sure we use local storage, and then we handled the Breeze import and export entities just like we did with saving all the local storage in the previous module. And we saved two pieces to local storage here. One was the WIP summary, just so we could load it into the one view, and then also each WIP entity. And we created an Angular directive to help us with the visual indicators to let people know when there was WIP or when it changed. We created new views to be able to go see what the WIP was. We took advantage of the Breeze APIs inside the Z storage service, which we wrapped inside an Angular module. And the net result is a better user experience so the user can stay on the client, make a bunch of changes, even close the browser, get a cup of coffee, and then come back, open it back up, and then they can edit any items they needed to. There's a lot of power that you can gain from reading and writing from local storage, and I hope this gives you some ideas on what you can use it for. And if you want to learn more about local storage, I highly recommend the course by Craig Shoemaker, shown right here at Pluralsight. And Craig not only explores local storage, but other alternative means of saving data on the client.